So, welcome back. We have another episode today of our podcast, Going Nowhere. And today, I've been hearing a lot the past week about the pyramids. I don't know if you heard anything about them, but
Really?
there's been a lot of talk about some new discoveries under the
Mm.
pyramids. So, I thought to bring it up with you.
Right.
And
Okay.
let me share my screen.
Hmm.
Share if I can start sharing my screen for the pyramids. So, the pyramids of Giza, as you know, many people know them. There's been a new study that's been circulating online that hasn't been peer reviewed, by the way. There's been some new
Ah.
findings
Hmm.
that they actually say that there has been a new discovery of giant pillars that extend up to something like 648 meters under.
And 48 meters.
Yes.
Is that not even
604.
taller than the pyramids themselves?
Yeah, this is like insane. So they're talking about they use some scanning technology, some kind of, you know, not sure, some kind of radar to look underneath the pyramids, and they've established something like this. They've established these eight, I think, pillars
Hmm.
that extend under the pyramids, and they say that at the bottom of them there are some kind of chambers as well under them. So I'm not sure if it's true. Obviously,
Hmm.
it's not peer reviewed, so obviously take it with a grain of salt. But it's
Yeah,
been
of
all the
course.
talk, all the raids in social media
Yeah,
this
that's
past
one of
week.
my bugbears is these articles from sometimes even reputable websites who say, "Oh, this amazing scientific discovery or amazing archaeological discovery will change the face of Egyptian archaeology forever," or whatever. So they're like really clickbaity titles, and it's very hard. Sometimes there is a really groundbreaking discovery, and sometimes it's just like you really clickbaited there. So it's very. That's what I. It would be good to have a website which actually talked about real, substantial archaeological breakthroughs without actually going too far into this sort of conspiracy theory land, or just blowing up the slightest little bit of information. But yeah, back to the pyramids. That was just my rant.
No, no, yeah. I mean, that's I want to have your take on it because it's all, it all sounds very mysterious and very, as you said, very clickbaity. But obviously, the findings have just been, I don't know if all the full findings have been released yet. As far as I understand, there was some kind of presentation of some sort somewhere,
Mm.
and they kind of gave the people like the initial findings, but obviously the full research has not been released and it hasn't been peer reviewed. So
Okay.
far,
Well,
uh,
let's for fun actually assume this is correct and see what comes of that. So there's eight. Are these hollow pillars or are these more like stone pillars?
they're saying that these are, it's very hard to know exactly what they are, but as far as I understand, there has been some kind of like scans that they've used to kind of look through, because obviously, apparently, I didn't even know that in Egypt no one can actually dig anywhere around the pyramids.
Yeah, I guess
um,
that's makes some sense, but also you might
so
miss
so
some
no one can
discovery.
dig, so there's no way to actually even verify this, because
Mm.
no one is allowed to dig, and I'm not sure anyone will be allowed to dig anytime soon. So they
Yeah,
use this kind of scanning technology to.
it's incredible they could scan under the pyramids, which we've been either going through the pyramid itself, the scanning software, the radar or whatever it is, or through the sand at the side of it, and penetrate 600 plus meters. Yeah, maybe there's the technology for all that, but that is incredible.
It is if you think about it. I mean, I suppose the scans are probably open to interpretation,
Yeah.
because different people could. read them differently, I suppose. So again, you can't know exactly, but they said there are these spiral paths as well
Interesting.
on those.
So that's very accurate then, in terms of they're not just seeing lines on this scan; they're seeing actual details.
Yeah, probably they can see, as you said, the difference between something, so they can see those spirals, I suppose, and they could be paths, they could be something else, but and at the end of it, they end into these kind of structures at the bottom of the pyramids. So these are kind
Mm.
of like chambers and stuff.
Looks very
So
modern and scientific, which I know a lot of people love to think the Egyptians were like these advanced, very advanced race scientifically, and then the scientific knowledge was lost. But what are the coils?
I think these are the paths that we're talking about. These are the
Oh, so right, so that's just part of the path.
this
But
is
then,
part of,
if
yeah.
there's eight of those things, is it eight? And then what are they all just really actually very close to each other, and just four on the top of each um, structure at
Structure.
the bottom, and there's two structures.
As far as they reported, I think that they're talking about, yes, as you said, these four pillars effectively end up to these kind of chambers at the bottom, which apparently all of the structure extends even further down, up to a total length of 2 kilometers. But I
Wow.
don't. This is just speculation. I think I'm not sure that they verified that the whole thing extends 2 kilometers down in this case. But even if you kind of take it as its face value that this is true and stuff, I'm not sure. Like, this would change everything, because I don't think anyone would be able to claim that people of that era would be able to drill at this level, at this depth, with the equipment they had at that time and the means they had, and creating something like that. I think that goes very far away from what would have been established for the time.
Yeah.
But on the opposite side, if it's all fake, right? If it's all like a misinterpretation of the results and whatnot, why do people want so much for there to be something else about the pyramids?
Yeah, well, I think there's a big romanticization of the past, and Graham Hancock's popularity of his theories has shown that, and there's other thinkers who are similar, and that's not to say there's no credence to those ideas. I think actually, as a whole system, it works quite well. But yeah, I think it taps into a psychological urge to. There's in many different philosophies and art traditions and whatever. There's this idea that we got this past golden age where we came from, that we fell from effectively. You could use the word the fall in terms of Adam and Eve, but it's really the idea in many cultures around the world that there was this enlightened age, enlightened scientifically and morally and spiritually, and that almost acts as a goal to get towards in our future. So although is it almost thinking that it's happened in the past allows us to think that we can reclaim it in the future, and I think that's a big impetus behind this romanticization of the past in terms of thinking they were enlightened in many different levels.
So you think it's all wishful thinking that our ancestors were maybe some kind of super advanced?
Well, yes and no. I think there's undoubtedly cases where previous cultures were more advanced than the cultures which preceded them. No, came after them.
Mm.
So, for instance, like the Dark Ages after the Roman Empire, even though
Mm.
that's debated now, like the term Dark Ages is a contentious term, but I think on some level there is some truth in it in terms of the Romans had, I think, flushing toilets, or at least advanced irrigation systems, and
Yeah,
there's no
they
doubt
had
they were quite
they
advanced.
had baths, they had sewage systems, they had such an advanced city structure. which still exists today in Rome, and um,
And
you
also
can
in
go
terms
and
of
visit.
philosophy, in Greece and Rome, there are so many of important philosophical ideas find roots there. At least the earliest textual versions of them that we have available to us. And in the Dark Ages, it's hard to name that many philosophers from like 200 AD to 1000. Or it looks there's some good early Islamic philosophers. So from like 200 AD to 800 AD, it's very hard to find for most people to name a significant philosopher from that period, and that's a lot of time. That's 600 years.
Mm.
So there's no doubt there is a change in like you get more advanced civilizations, and for whatever reason they fall intellectually and maybe spiritually. I don't know, but yeah, just in terms of we'll go from enlightened ages to less enlightened ages and back to more enlightened ages. But the idea that there was like a super advanced previous civilization, which is not necessarily what Graham Hancock
Mm.
proposes, but he does seem to suggest that they were perhaps more advanced than I would probably guess they were from the evidence I have come
Mm.
across.
I mean, yeah, the mainstream information is something that everyone knows, that the pyramids were built as tombs for the pharaohs, and they had all these hundreds of thousands of people working on them, and obviously they used complex ramp systems and cranes and stuff to lift all the stones to the correct heights and everything else. But the theories online after this kind of revelation about these structures underneath the pyramids, the conspiracy theories have really
Mm.
reignited about them being
Well,
all sorts of things, from created by aliens to an ancient super advanced civilization that somehow either left or became extinct, to even them actually being a power source. They're saying
yeah,
that this was some kind of advanced kind of power generation slash
which would
storage.
undermine the idea that the pyramids were burial chambers, at least initially. They might have later become burial chambers, which I know it's a popular idea amongst I guess conspiracy theorists on the whole is that the pyramids weren't actually burial chambers, or at least some of them weren't, and
Mm,
they had other uses. And there does seem to be, on the face of it, some evidence for that in terms of there's just a lot more inside the pyramids, which seems unnecessary if you were just using it to bury someone there. And so some people think that they were used as places of worship, effectively,
mm,
of carrying out rituals.
mm. To me, in my mind, like, it sounds like an extreme amount of effort just for a tomb. In my
Yeah,
mind.
but then if you think about it, the kings had all the money, well, a lot of the money and a lot of the power at that time, and they're the ones who care about their death. So
I get that, but like, we've never
it's not
seen this
surprising.
level of structure before. This kind of something so grand.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
they were,
just playing devil's advocate, obviously.
yeah, but they were a very advanced civilization, not like advanced compared to the technology we have today, but they were way more advanced than many of the cultures around them, perhaps all of the cultures around them. And so they did have this amazing technology, and they just needed the motivation to put it into.
But to me, it sounds more plausible what you said, that, for example, there could have been places of worship, like, kind of the Aztecs had their pyramids, some sort of structures where they did rituals, and obviously they did all kinds of religious slash, you know,
Yeah.
sacrificial rituals at the time. So I could see that being more the case rather than just a place such as a tomb where it's never going to be used again, and it's just there to build it, seal it, and forget about it.
But
But
yeah,
as you
like
said,
there are so many burials seems to suggest that at least at some point the pyramids did become places of where people were buried. Whether maybe even some of the older, maybe say for instance, play devil's advocate, that some of them were originally not built for burial, and they were built for other reasons, but then even some of those would have been commandeered later for burials, perhaps.
Hmm.
But yeah, like
I,
the first picture you showed those pillars
this one.
going
Yeah.
down into what looked like water. So I was just going to ask if there was any theories about
Y-
the significance of it extending perhaps into water.
I'm not sure that it was meant to be. I just think this is just a diagram where it just shows that they go all the way down. But as far
Right.
as I understand, people were saying that they go down to these sort of square like chambers. And I there was another picture I saw, which is this one, where it shows
Because
these
the
structures.
spiral suggests the travel of something either small or liquid upwards. So it suggests to me water, because if they're extending really far down, then eventually you get more and more water, is
Mm.
my understanding. Um, so maybe you could do some research today by not drilling under the pyramid, but drill as close as you can to the pyramid without getting in trouble. See what you get at around that length. So if you drill 600, 700 meters, what is there which might be significant? Is it a type of stone? Is it more water?
It's tricky that we have all this technology today, and we still cannot fully investigate sites like those, for example, because there is a lot of red tape or because
Well,
there's
yeah,
no will. Or...
Göbekli Tepe is probably the most interesting psychological structure. Psychological structure? No, archaeological structure. That's yeah, that's not good. They've said you're not allowed to excavate for the next bit for a certain number of years, and then the next bit for a certain number of years, because the idea is the technology of the archaeologists will progressively improve, and so it's almost better to leave the excavation till later, until you got the better technology.
I mean, yeah, because you don't want to end up damaging, I suppose,
Yeah,
anything in the process of excavating it and then altering the evidence in some way because you just got this all this excavation
yeah.
equipment
Like
there that could end up
the
damaging
classic
something because
example is the excavation of Troy, which was once seen as a mythological city.
mm,
I think Schumann, archaeologist, someone Schumann, German, found found the site and he excavated it, but he didn't excavate it very well. So a lot of the site was destroyed because it was just
precisely.
he or his colleagues just deemed some of it just irrelevant. And
And this is just one example, you know. There's so many cases that I've read of excavation activities going wrong or exposing something to the elements which quickly erodes it and then destroys part of it or all of it
mm,
or changes a lot of the evidence that are there just by being exposed to the elements. So I can
yeah,
imagine why obviously there's a lot of pushback on digging anywhere and excavating stuff without knowing what's happening. So as you said.
yeah. Well, like things like pottery shards used to not be seen as important by some archaeologists, and therefore they'd just be thrown away. But actually, someone's later theories were like suggested that actually pottery shards could be very accurate and
Mm.
useful for dating when each level of a site was built.
Of course, and I could imagine also examining the actual individual materials of the clay that was used and kind of getting information about the geology of the area or anything else, or
Mm.
you know, what about the techniques that they used even probably to create the clay pots at the time. So I can imagine all of it could create, information for us about the time that they were made. So as you said, nothing is insignificant, no matter how small or
Mm.
big it is in this case.
Yes, I think certainly with archaeology, although it can be frustrating to go slowly, I think it's probably makes sense in the long run in terms of just go on the side of just being a bit more conservative about how quickly you go, and so keep going progressively. Don't pause excavations. Just keep going, but also go slowly.
Did you know that also Nikola Tesla also believed that the pyramids were that they served some kind of power source as well? as some kind
I
of
know there's all these
partials.
sort of theories which tie Nikola Tesla's ideas to the
Going down
ideas
the
that
rabbit hole
people,
now.
yeah, people assume they assume the ancient Egyptians had ideas similar to Tesla's ideas, and there's all these ideas about energy moving the
Mm,
stones into place and all that. Yeah, it's not to say it's definitely not the case, but I think to assume that is definitely the case is probably wrong on the current evidence that we actually have. It's an interesting theory which might have credence to it, but it's not. It probably still the most likely theory. If you were to say Occam's razor, you just
mm,
the best theory is the one which is seems the most likely, and like although this is a very monumental effort, literally,
mm,
it was probably it's probably still more likely that slave labor or people paid labor were loads of people were just moving these stones into place. Although that does seem difficult to imagine how they did it at that time, but they were an advanced culture, and if we are quite ingenious, and when we put enough effort behind something physical and mental, then we can actually pull off some amazing feats. So, even although the pyramids were very big, some of the cathedrals built
mm.
even like just at the end of the Dark Ages were very significant feats of engine architecture. So, yeah, we if we put our minds to something, we can usually do it.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. I just like to kind of showcase all the different things that people were talking about online that I've been reading and
Yeah,
kind of bring
there's a
it
lot
up.
of I think wish for like to find engineering artifacts to back up this theory that they were advanced, and there are one or two things which archaeologists have discovered which seem like they are from the space age or at least the modern age, but on the whole, we've found very little things or archaeological artifacts which seem out of kilter with the time period.
Mm.
Um, so we found no like advanced turbo engines or all that sort of things. There is one thing which I forget what the name of it was, which some people argue was evidence of this. But you'd expect if it was an advanced civilization, we'd be finding loads of these advanced looking technology, but we just find on the whole stuff which is impressive but not necessarily out of kilter with our idea of that time period.
No, I agree. As you said, I think a lot of people would really want to believe that there is something that is being hidden from us, or that it's all connected with something else, and on all the other conspiracy theories of like energy and electricity and whatnot, or unlimited
Mm.
energy for everyone and things like that. And the pyramids were this kind of mega structures of electricity harvesting and storage. But as you said, as other people have said before, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. And unless we could actually see that this here is these structures can be excavated and we are all able to see them and they're like that and they actually do extend to these depths and everything else, a scan is a scan, you know, unless, and it probably can be interpreted differently. Someone who has a lot of experience with reading like scans of the ground and the bedrock and everything could say, oh, this is just how this type of rock might appear in a scan, you know, and it's
Mm.
nothing like all these elaborate sketches.
Yeah, well, the same problem, and I see a lot of clickbait articles about this these days. Since Graham Hancock highlighted it on his TV series on Netflix, which is actually an interesting TV series. So
Which TV
there's probably
series?
some interesting evidence, although I think as a whole narrative, I'm not on board with it. But yeah, the idea that there's a really old pyramid, so I believe it's over 20,000 years old. This is, but actually, which would make it, if you assume the Egyptian pyramids are around 5,000 years old, the
Mm.
older ones. So this would make it by far older. But it seems like there might have been a natural structure which made some which looked kind of man-made, but then
Mm.
was built over by later peoples, and so that confused matters because it looked like it was natural but also man-made.
I've heard something about that, about the Sphinx, for example, in Egypt. Effectively, like a big hill or a mountain, or like, no, like a smaller hill or a smaller
Right.
sort of mountain, and then it was kind of already exposed to the elements and kind of eroded, and then people just sculpted it, kind of look more like the Sphinx.
Yeah.
Obviously, I can see there's being some truth into that
A lot of
in
people
this
say the
case.
Sphinx is, well, a lot of the people in this movement would argue that the Sphinx is not as is older than the Egyptians, or at least the civilization that we think of as the Egyptians.
Well, that would tie into that. Well, if it was a natural formation that was then, you know, sculpted to look more like what it is now today, then it would make sense. Or modified. Maybe it was something else at that time and then it was modified. I don't know.
Possibly,
It's
yeah. There's all sorts of theories about the Sphinx, which I think there's just it'd be strange that there's just the Sphinx, which is older, and there's no other evidence of the culture which built it.
there's people that believe that even the pyramids are older than what it's currently estimated.
Yeah, well, the problem is that you can't carbon date rock, and so you can only carbon date things like biological matter stuck in the between the bricks or whatever, or stuff which has blown in there, which theoretically might have blown in there at a later date when it was actually built. So yeah, you can build this narrative that things are older than the archaeological date that they've been given by consensus, but it's not necessarily
Hmm.
surefire evidence for that point of view, because there's also a lot of evidence for it for the consensus point of view, because it just fits in with all the other things that were built around the same time,
Hmm.
and that eventually fits in with the works of literature and whatever which were around at the time, and it just seems to currently fit quite well, not perfectly, but it seems to fit quite well with all the stuff we know. It seems most likely that it is the archaeologists have got it roughly right. And although you could make the argument for it being older, and you can definitely make it, Graham Hancock makes a fairly good argument, even though most archaeologists wouldn't want to admit it. But I
Hmm.
think still it is more likely that these advanced structures were built but by the Egyptians as we think of them.
Hmm. Yeah, I I think as well, as you say, unless we have extraordinary evidence that they weren't.
I do
It's
think he makes some interesting points, Graham Hancock, in terms
hmm.
of big structures often being built on spiritually significant places, whether it's like ley lines, which
Hmm.
I don't know how they work, but it does it does seem like a lot of structures are built on ley lines, and however people, however ancient people knew that they were ley lines, I don't know, but yeah, that's interesting, and also building them on bits of land which is considered sacred, which often has a water source, because water is considered sacred by a lot of people.
Yeah, water is life, isn't it?
Yeah, like, at least symbolically, water is, well, actually, literally as well.
Hmm.
Water is life, but then it gets turned into a symbol as water is life, and there's a lot of instances of holy water or sacred
Hmm.
water, which run through most of the world's traditions.
And water was really integrated into the Egyptian culture as well, because I had watched a documentary at some point in the past where it was saying how the Nile during the months of the year would dry up almost during the summer months, and everything would obviously completely, and the scenery would completely change.
Mm.
Um, and then again, when it came back later in the year, when the waters kind of came back through, they would again transform the terrain at that time into fertile land with crops for everyone, and everything
Mm.
would be much easier. The life would be transformed effectively.
So you really were reminded of the life-giving power of water.
Precisely.
And I believe there is a god or goddess of the river Nile as well. So that shows a direct um, link between the sacred and water.
Mm.
And that also in India as well, the river Ganges is associated with the goddess Ganga, and so that
Mm.
still has that link there.
Mm.
And often, yeah, in many different philosophies and religions, and especially ancient ones, there is the fuzzy line between God and physiological or like a physical process. So, in terms of, yeah, like the God in Homer's Odyssey, or it might be the Iliad, Hephaestus is the god of fire. So the Greeks were described as cooking over Hephaestus. So
Mm.
Homer doesn't use the word fire; he uses the word Hephaestus. So it was a very blurred line between physical things and gods.
Yeah. You mentioned just a minute ago the ley lines.
Hmm.
Would you want to talk a little bit about them for people that don't know them?
I researched them a while ago, so my knowledge of them is quite fuzzy. But it's I think what I could say is it seems like there are sites, especially archaeological sites or cathedrals, which are
Mm.
built. It's sort of almost in line with each other, and I believe if some of these lines, some people say Glastonbury is a site where lots of these lines converge as well. So it's considered a sacred space. So yeah, it's I'm not sure how much what the thinking is that goes into where these lines are, because I think it's not just the case that they're looking at these significant structures lining up in a line from like
Mm.
Egypt or whatever to England. I don't know if that's the case, but from over long periods, they're actually looking at some other evidence. But
Mm.
there is a culture in Colombia, I think the Kogi people, who see they really believe that there are these invisible lines everywhere, and like it's like a net that holds nature together.
If I'm not wrong, they've said that a lot of the pyramids all over the world are like on the same axis as those lines, and they're often on the same kind of plane if you map them out. I'm not sure if it's true, but I've heard that a lot of pyramids from different that have been built obviously at different times and by different cultures around the world can be traced on similar axes apparently around the world, which
I
might be the same as those ley lines. And I don't know, and I also know that there is also an astrological significance of where these structures are built in relationship to the stars and
Yeah,
the
I think there's no doubt the ancient cultures were obsessed with the skies,
mm,
and it's like the earliest science, as it were. And obviously, it was very imbued with religion, but also they were studying or looking at real phenomena. And so, like a lot of the temples at Malta, Graham
mm,
Hancock actually suggests were periodically rebuilt because they were built in the first instance to keep track of a certain star. I think it was the dog star in that case. And so they would move it every, I don't know, few hundred years so that their new structure would line up with the star. And Göbekli Tepe, I think, they've shown evidence that they were also trying to aim at a star, which is
mm,
interesting. It shows almost like an obsession with something
mm,
which we see as interesting, maybe, but not really that significant. So it suggests either a religious belief in the importance of that star, or maybe it served other purposes. So if you could track the star, then you got a focal point where all your other knowledge can stem off from in terms of tracking the rest of the sky and also time and maybe other things,
Hmm.
maybe ultimately related to getting a good harvest and
Yeah, I was going to
surviving.
say that it's often the case to track the seasons and the change of the relationship of the earth to the sun and stuff like that. I
Yeah,
think at the
so
time.
not to necessarily reduce their worldview in terms of their whole religion was ultimately just about whether they could eat ultimately. But it does seem like that's the most likely theory, is that they saw this as important directly or indirectly because it allowed them to get a better understanding, which helped them survive.
Hmm. So, what do you think, in short, of this potential discovery about the pyramids?
Well, it looks interesting, but there's enough interesting stuff which has more evidence to interest me for now. But I'm very open in 5 years if this gets, like, if we actually get real research which shows, yeah, pretty much for sure there are these things, and then I will take another look.
Hmm. I agree. I agree. For me, it's a very interesting prospect, but I like to kind of indulge into the idea that there might
Yeah,
be something.
it's fun, but yeah, you can end up getting pulled into way too many different directions.
No, exactly. And there's so many conspiracy theories and rabbit holes, as you say, that you can end up getting stuck on and captured by. And I don't want anyone to think that we're trying to push people in some kind of conspiracy rabbit hole.
Yeah, I think it's just a bit of fun, really. And some of these theories, which sound clickbaity now, will end up having some credence to them when there's more research done. But it's probably better just to focus on the stuff we have more evidence for now, and then build our theories of knowledge on that. And I think a lot of the stuff we know already is pretty fascinating in physics and in archaeology. So we don't really need to go making it even more fantastical.
Mm. Um, on that note about fantastical views and experiences, I've been reading the book you recommended me to read,
Which
The
one's that?
Secret History of Christianity by Mark
Yeah.
Vernon. And I've been thinking that, as you say, paid so much more. It was a different perspective, let's put it that way, of the world that the people lived in and their place into the world. I really like this kind of case that Mark
What
Vernon
period
makes.
are you reading about or referring to in this case, or is it all of them
The
more
period of
generally?
ancient Greece, particularly, has
Ancient Greece.
been captured me in kind of how he talks about Socrates a lot
Mm,
and how he would have been a man of his time, even though his views at the time were considered very extreme. But the way he would be experiencing the world was very different to how modern people, or even people from different cultures, religious or non-religious, see the world, because he had a very keen interest in things that appeared mundane. But as soon as he asked the question, why does this mundane thing happen like that, it became important. And it wasn't, or it became significant and also sometimes spiritual, I suppose. He was talking about, he gave an example just to say how a blacksmith would tamper a blade by obviously heating it up and then cooling it down, and then you'd make a different sound each time based on the temperature and the cooling and how fast this happened. And sometimes he would say, oh, this sounds almost like a note from an instrument.
mm,
So, and then and then in his mind he would ask, why is this happening? And then he would try and give explanations or whatnot. And it was a completely different way of thinking. And and he's tying that with how people believe they were part of this world where God influenced the way they lived, and how gods were almost among them, because that's kind of how it was with the Greek mythology back then. And they were part of the system as much as the gods were. So it was a completely different way of thinking. So I can imagine that a lot of symbols and a lot of things would have held so much more gravity and significance for people back then, for different cultures, even if it was just a star that people were building structures for, or if it was just smaller things, let's say. Everything was
yeah.
attributed to the gods and they were all part of that system as well.
Although Socrates, in a way, was a move away from that more
Which
mythological
was
thinking.
exactly.
Although he believed that he had a soul, as it were, or a guiding spirit.
As you said, almost like a familiar from his Dark Materials, where you've
Oh yeah, yeah. It's
mentioned before.
yeah, very much like his Dark Materials in terms of everyone has a soul, which has
Yeah,
yeah, and some people would call save a soul is of the opposite gender to the person who has the soul, but that's
interesting. I didn't know that. Why is
yeah,
that?
like Carl Jung's theories is yeah, every man has an anima as their soul, so anima ending in a, so it's feminine, and then every woman would have an animus, which they need to bring out for wholeness, and that's their soul as well. But yeah, I think although that can be helpful, it's also a bit, and probably Jung acknowledged it was also symbolic as well. So, but yeah, what we were talking about, yeah, how Socrates viewed the world and how the early Greek philosophers were moving away from the view of the world of even Homer. So,
Hmm.
several hundred years before Socrates, um, who saw gods everywhere in terms of going back to the idea of cooking your meat over Hephaestus, so seeing
Hmm.
fire as God.
This is kind of what reminded me of it. That's why I brought up the conversation about the book.
Yeah, and I think it was Thales, like who's argued to be the first philosopher, which is
Hmm.
debated now, but he was a philosopher earlier than Socrates, and I believe it was him or his followers. One of them said, "But everything that moves has a soul." And so it's
Hmm.
the idea that you got all the things in the world, but anything that moves, including us, has a soul. And so wind was have a soul, and so the Greek word for wind was also the word for spirit. So pneuma.
Nephma. Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it now? Yeah,
Nephma.
it's
Yeah.
probably how you pronounce it back then. But yeah, I never learnt ancient Greek or Greek for matter. So, but yeah, no,
It's used in today's
interesting.
modern Greek as well.
What does it mean in
Pneuma
modern?
means soul, effectively.
So, does it mean breath still?
You would say pnoi, which is breath, which is
So it's close. Yeah.
could be said, yeah, which is effectively the breath, because we'd say someone died and they let out their last pnoi, their
Mm.
last breath. So it is very similar in a way.
Yeah,
Uh,
it makes sense why people would think that breath is linked with spirit, because once you breathe your last, then you are no longer animated. And so anima,
mm,
going back to the word Carl Jung's word for
and
soul,
anything that
anima,
moves,
which comes
yeah.
from the ancient Greek, then yeah, as something which is animated. We are animated creatures until we die, and the
Mm,
idea is that our soul does that, or the breath is linked to that. I guess the breath is a more scientific way of explaining it, and the soul is a more spiritual way of explaining it. But in a way, there's a lot of overlap between those two ways of seeing things, and the ancients might not have seen those as too different to each other. We like to think
mm,
of the ancients as sort of unscientific, but I think a lot of them would have thought of themselves as very scientific, but they just wouldn't have separated the religious, spiritual aspect of reality so sharply as we do. But they'll
mm,
see it as more integrated, which has its pros and its cons.
And as you said, and as we've talked before, that the breath is so significant in so many cultures over almost the whole of human civilization.
Mm.
There is the breath is linked to so many. Its significance is everywhere in all the cultures,
Yeah,
almost
yeah,
of
it is
all
quite
times,
striking.
which is quite striking. Exactly how important it is and how different practices focus on the breath.
Yeah, well, on one level, this works as a metaphor. On one level, it's obvious that our breath is our life and that we are
Mhm.
dependent on things outside of us, which makes us think of ourselves not as just an individual, but also as linked inherently to things outside of us. The air outside of us is as much our lungs, our breathing system, as our lungs.
It reminds me also Alan Watch puts a lot of significance in, the breathing
Mm,
and how the breathing is important because it's something that you can control but also not control. That
yeah,
happens passively but also actively.
yeah. So it shows there's part of us which is just us. It's happening, but we're not consciously affecting it. But we can also consciously affect our breath by
When I
either
when I was younger, sometimes when I would think about breathing, I wouldn't be able to breathe. I would be like, if I stop doing it consciously, I might die.
yeah, yeah. When you think it's actually quite hard to actually just watch for breath sometimes when
Mm.
you get meditation techniques where you just supposed to watch for breath, but the very watching of it can sometimes sort of stifle it, like
Affected.
in a big way or a very small way, and it's hard to know what sometimes whether you are breathing as you would have done if you weren't paying attention to it.
Mm.
But yeah, going back to the idea of the ancients is the idea of the breath is linked to our spirit, or at least our psychology, is obvious because we are when we our breath is our environment, as many people have said. So when we go calmer in our breath, then we can't be stressed.
Mm.
Like just physiologically, it just doesn't work. Just as we can't feel gratitude and fear at the same time, it's like a spectrum in our brain, and we're either at one end or the other. So if we are very breathing very quickly when we're obviously going to be psychologically stressed, so one triggers the other and vice versa, and so we can change our psychological state by changing our breath.
Mm.
So yeah, you could really see why ancient peoples saw the breath as very linked to spirituality or psychology. I think
Mm.
even there's a story of Jesus breathing on someone and saying, "This is the Holy Spirit," but I forget that story exactly.
Yeah, the book really, the one that I was saying about the secret history of Christianity by Mark Vernon, really gives a very interesting, per, a very interesting perspective on all these different times of history and how Christianity shaped the cultures, but it was also shaped by the cultures that it affected in a way.
Yes,
Mm.
yeah. Yeah, well, I guess Christianity, the biggest example of that is perhaps how Christianity didn't really grow massively until a few hundred years after Jesus, and it was made the religion of empire. And so, obviously, a lot of Christian teachings remains, but also things were added to it, which made it conducive to being the religion of empire, and also borrowed elements from the previous gods, which had
Mm.
been the head of the empire. And Jesus perhaps attracted more descriptions as a king or an emperor, and
Mm.
yeah, I think there was links to previous gods.
There is, even today, for example, in Greece, just to give examples, we have saints that are protectors of sailors, saints that are protectors of farmers, and saints that are protectors of all sorts in this
Yeah,
case. So, which is very similar to how it was before, where you had gods that were the protectors of sailors or protectors of the land, and you had nature and Dimitra, which was the goddess of harvest, and similar cases like that. So you still have a little bit of that in Christianity, even in modern Christianity.
yeah. I know some people have argued that Christianity is polytheism by the back door, which is why some people would not like. That's probably an argument that a lot of Muslims would have against Christianity, in preference of they say that Islam is superior because it is a more clear cut religion
Mm.
without all the emphasis on saints and even
Mm.
Jesus as well, in terms of there is this God, but we don't know much about him, mysterious God. And Christianity works and is attractive though because it allows people to feel a connection to this hard to define God through the intermediaries of Jesus, but also through the saints as well.
Mm.
So it almost by giving a face to the faceless, it allows you to, because we're human, it allows us to connect perhaps in a way which is better for us psychologically. But yeah, obviously it can have people criticize it for the same reason.
Yeah, of course, because you end up being in a very idolatric system of faith where you worship idols instead of
Yeah, which
actually.
which is one of the big debates that runs through Christianity, especially, and Judaism. Obviously, you have the commandment against idols,
I
and
completely. If you go to, if you actually, I've experienced it. Like in Greece, growing up, there were people that were worshiping pictures of like paintings of saints and stuff, as if they are something living, as if there is like a living saint of some kind,
mm,
and it was just a paint. It was just a painting of a saint, which was dated back to, I don't know when it was. Even if you see our churches, they're all covered in murals
mm,
and paintings, and people, it's effectively worshiping the idols, worshiping the paintings, worshiping the photos, worshiping the physical stuff that you can have, the cross itself.
Yeah, you could certainly be critical of that argument, and the same with Buddhism as well. There's probably more idols of Buddha than perhaps anyone
Mm,
else in the world, and apparently he said, and I can imagine it fits in with his philosophy that he said, "Don't make any idols of me."
mm,
But yeah, we do have a psychological need for idols, we might say, not necessarily need, but an attraction to them. And to call them just idols idols have an undertone of negativity sometimes. So if someone calls it an idol, often they're being critical, which obviously there is criticism that can be made, but also I feel there's also positives to it. But yeah, like it's interesting, in Greece, there's so many idols everywhere,
mm,
more than the Western Church, which they
mm,
still have idols or pictures. But yeah, there was a big debate about it in the first several hundred years of Christianity. You went through several phases of
mm,
the church deciding, yeah, let's have no idols, let's go back and get rid of all the
mm,
idols. And so
mm.
you'd have hiding or
Yeah,
destroying of
there
many
was.
of the early images of Christ. And so we actually had very few images of Jesus for the first several hundred years of Christendom or the Christian movement.
Mm. I definitely I always in my mind I always found it took away from the true spiritual nature of religion. The way I would see people just worship those
Mm,
pictures, because it wasn't just that. In Greece, there were so many cases when I was growing up where they would say, "Oh, this picture of Mary, mother of Jesus, has been weeping, and there are tears coming down." And there were accounts of, like, you'd see like marks on top of the image, and people would say, "Oh yeah, this is really happening. This is a divine revelation."
mm.
And I'd say, it's either some kind of foul play here, or I don't know.
So
There is
did you
something.
see the evidence of what looked like water coming through the eyes?
I don't think there was actual recorded. I'm not sure.
Oh,
I
but yeah, you
remember there
didn't
were
see it.
cases where you'd see the marks on it, and I would
Mm,
think there's 100 reasons why there could be marks on it or whatnot, and people would say it was because the picture has wept. And to me, that would always detract from, this is all gimmicks and
yeah, like
parlor tricks.
certainly, like, I think there's lots of good evidence for a higher power, as it were. And I think many people who see themselves as spiritual but not religious is a very big movement of people in the modern world. Is they see there's some sort of maybe higher power. They struggle to put their finger on it, but they get also disillusioned with normal religion because they see so many examples of it being just used to exploit people, or that
Mm.
people themselves exploiting themselves from the truth, as it were,
Eh,
because there's clear examples, like, not say that maybe sometimes there are miracles, but there are clear examples when people are just deluding themselves, which
mm.
makes you skeptical of the whole religious enterprise because it sort of taints your whole view of it.
And especially
Uh,
the church, because there were, in all of this, just to add, in all these examples where an image wept or something, extraordinary happened with them, people, of course, would flock by the thousands on that temple to see the image, to worship the image, to pray in front of the image, to
mm,
to even touch the image, because they were thinking that they would be cured of things, that they would be saved, or that they would have, the blind would see again, or something extraordinary like that would happen, because it's revealed to be a divine artifact of some sort that can
mm.
help people. You see what I mean? It's all a little bit, to
Yeah,
me, that
like,
always took
as when
away.
you're a skeptical type, it's very hard to get over that element of religion, um, and to play. I don't know if it's devil's advocate, but just to say that in a way, you could say the more of these instances where people believe that, oh, this is this is worth traveling to see it in real life, it imbues that thing with a lot of meaning, which maybe be used as a psychological tool, allows you to actually drop a lot of what they would call sin away, in terms of
Mm,
your we seem to be psychologically hardwired, which may also mean spiritually hardwired. I reserve judgment on that, but we seem to be psychologically hardwired to need sometimes a trigger to allow us to let go of guilt and unhelpful thinking, perhaps as well. And so, in a way, the more of these idols or whatever we have, or relics that we can go and travel to, and the traveling itself builds it up as something
The
significant.
pilgrimage.
The thing you're going to, yes. And so it's imbued with all these sort of psychological, we could call them fallacies, but they also have psychological weight, which allows us to trigger a change in behavior. So you could almost make the analogy to how a marketer might use psychological tactics to get someone to donate to charity. So in a way, the end goal perhaps is a good one, but as skeptics, you would perhaps be less inclined to donate to that charity because you see all the psychological gameplay that is being played. So yeah, I think, yeah, in a way, the church would be perhaps wise to get rid of idols, but also it's wise to allow idols as well, because they attract two different types of people.
Yeah, in Greece that would never change. Like idols are deeply ingrained
Yeah,
into the
and
culture.
same with when I went to India, you saw idols everywhere, and in a way, it felt like it cheapens the
Yeah,
religion, because
to me
religion
it
is
does.
so mundane. It's everywhere. It's just an image, and you could argue that some traditions, the image is more, but there is no image, and it's just hidden away more. There's more mystery to it. It feels maybe more truth to it, and also there's less ways that people can make money off that religion, because it's not like something you can sell t-shirts or statues of. And that's another thing which people who are skeptical, like you and me, skeptically minded, will get put off religion because it's so often tied to commercial efforts.
Exactly, precisely that. I would have the same views growing up. You'd go to all the churches, they'd all be full of images, full of murals, full of pictures that people would just walk in and start kissing every image.
Yeah.
It's like I would see that and I'm like, first, spreading germs much, you know?
Yeah, that must be
Secondly,
interesting in COVID.
yeah, secondly, it's just worshipping a photo, worshipping a picture. It's
Yeah,
just,
I guess you could argue that at least, as long as people probably do know that picture isn't the thing, it's like it's a conduit, a gate, a portal to
I get that,
the
but to
greater
me,
experience.
it would be just a picture and people act as if it's,
Mm. But it could be that our minds are actually more powerful than we think they are, and therefore our minds imbuing something with a quality or a value actually gives it some sort of quality or value, or allows it to be used.
yeah,
So
that is true. That is
there could
true.
be something to it. Yeah.
We give meaning to the world around us and give power to things, as you say. And there's also obviously the placebo effect is a very strong phenomenon that has
Yeah.
been established in
Yeah,
medicine,
and it actually helps us get better, like
and
in
it
some.
actually does help us get better
So it's like,
significantly as
is it
well.
a scam? Is it not? It's sort of both.
Like there are drugs that don't come out just because our own placebo effect is so strong that the drug isn't doing as good of a job as our own body does when it thinks it's actually getting a drug.
Mm.
And the same thing I think can be said for placebo effect in any aspect of our lives. As you said, when people believe something has power over them, even it can trigger a lot of other subconscious even processes in our minds and our bodies that we're not even aware of, I suppose. So I'm not saying that it's the worst thing anyone can do, obviously, to
Yeah.
to worship pictures like that.
Yeah.
It
Like
just to me did not.
art.
It always did nothing for me.
Yeah. I can see that. But like art and music can move us, perhaps in a similar way, towards this other reality, or this more holistic way of viewing this current reality, perhaps. So, but then some people would even argue that art and music are problematic, even not like obviously idolatrous art, but just art itself, as most great art will convey some sort of a deep feeling and spiritual message. So you could argue that art then puts us in contact with the sacred, but also the danger is when you see the sacred as something that you need the portal for to access, and therefore you think, oh, I need to have some sort of portal to access it, and which perhaps causes problem sometimes, especially when you can't get that portal anymore for whatever reason, or you lose
Mm.
faith in that portal. So yeah, it's an interesting one. It's a debate that's run through religion for forever, and even like the Reformation and the destruction of Catholic churches or the monasteries in England during Henry VIII's reign. What stoked the fire was the corruption in the church.
Mm.
Yeah, it was probably the Reformation. If we'd been living back then, probably me and you would probably been on the side of the Reformation. Even though I'm coming round to seeing actually there was probably a lot of wisdom in what the Catholics were arguing. But the trouble is, it was such a big church, and there was a lot of corruption as you get in any big organisation. And then you've also got just things which had developed in the church for the millennia and a half after Jesus' death, which weren't actually in the Bible, which may have had psychological value, but then the Protestants would have argued, yeah, this wasn't actually in the Bible, so why are we putting so much weight on it? And then
And
a big debate was
I
whether
think, as you said,
whether Jesus was actually in the bread and wine.
Yeah.
Whether the bread was actually Jesus' body is that was actually a very contentious issue where a lot of people actually got burnt at the stake for being on the wrong side of that argument.
And I think a lot of people would argue that is another issue that people have with religion, that it's been changed and reiterated so much over the years, in a way, in terms of the customs, in terms of the idols, in terms of the variations of it. It kind of undermines a little bit its power, maybe.
Yeah, well, it does. There's obviously argument that a lot of atheists would make is if you were born in another culture, then you have a whole other set of idols and people and
true.
gods and whatever you'd admire. So that does undermine the idea that there is truth in them. I think what overcomes that to some extent is if you see them as symbolically or psychologically true, as they may not be literally true, but those images, but they give you some sort of psychological. They're almost a reflection of our psychological makeup, and so our religions will have maybe be started with a set of stories, and then over the years, our psychological makeup will add in the missing elements. For instance, some would argue that Christianity lacks a divine female figure or a sacred mother figure, and that Mary got elevated as a result of that because our psyche couldn't tolerate not having a sacred mother figure. Which goes back to Göbekli Tepe. We had what looks like male and female figures, which were representing the divine masculine and divine feminine. So it looks like that is deeply ingrained in our psychology. So Christianity naturally would add Mary in, but then there's also the skeptics like the Protestants would actually de-emphasize Mary to some extent because in the biblical stories, especially other than Luke, the Gospel of Luke, doesn't really play a very big part.
But I can imagine that this would alienate a large percentage of the female population, for example, with religion, if there wasn't any representation of any key female character throughout, all the divine process.
Yeah, I think that's true. I would also play devil's advocate to that, and I think actually maybe it was the men who really craved having a divine female figure, because if you think of religion as something which helps our soul, and going back to Carl Jung's idea of in the men's soul is the anima, is the feminine aspect. Having a divine figure which is female allows men to get in contact with that feminine side and therefore come to a greater state of wholeness.
I like that as well. That's a good way to interpret it as well. Yeah, I can get on board with that.
Yeah,
I can
it's
see
just
why.
theory,
I can see why people. I mean, one or another, as you said, there has to be, I think, representation from both masculine and feminine sides. Because if you think about it, as you said, in the times of ancient Greece, we had so many female goddesses as part of, just as significant as their male counterparts of the pantheon of ancient gods. So they were just as important.
And
I think
Isis, in the first female ruler of ancient Egypt, was arguably more important than her husband Osiris, who was the first male leader of Egypt in mythology. So, and same with Hindu gods. Hindu is obviously a problematic term, but the gods, many Indian gods would have counterparts which are feminine, which they'd be seen as almost as important as their masculine counterparts, although often they'd be slightly de-emphasized. So the triad of gods who are most emphasized are Brahman, Vishnu, and Shiva, which are male, but they also have very respected wives who are also like the counter triad, the feminine triad.
Very interesting. Well, I think we're coming towards the end of our episode. I think it's a good place for us to wrap up probably with this. And if anyone has any questions or anything to add on the discussion about the pyramids we've had, or any conspiracy theories that other people think that might be at play here, or any other ideas that people have about this news, I think both of us would like to hear about them, and maybe in the comments underneath the video. And also about our discussion about religion and the evolution of it that we've kind of touched a little bit. So let us know. And if you have, John, anything to add?
No, I don't think I do. So yeah, let's leave it there.
Yeah, and let's go again nowhere next time.